What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to review some LLinusLLove versus Limitless heads up hand histories. Limitless has been playing everybody heads up for the last year or so, and we're going to do a heads up review series where we basically look at Limitless playing everybody heads up and see how he does. Last year, Limitless apparently won over $1 million playing these heads up games, and he's been running pretty good, it looks like. But he's not just going to win every pot, and we've got LLinusLLove as his opponent today, who's arguably the best heads-up player today. So I've heard some, rumblings from the Scandinavian rumor mill, and I heard that Linus is very highly respected, and obviously Limitless is a very highly respected player himself. Otherwise, more people would be in line to play him, and there's just not that many people who are willing to do so. So, with that introduction, let's do the first hand. So this is 10k No Limit in PokerStars. I'll also be reviewing some other opponents of Limitless against whom he played 20k No Limit even. But today we start off slowly. Alright, so we've got a 245 open raise by Linus. He really wants to save that $5. Seems like a fine sizing. It's what I would use when playing heads up. So I'm glad to see that at least I've got a couple of things in common with their heads up game. And Limitless defends, which he's going to do with a wide range. There's only one opponent to worry about, so he's getting a good price to call, but obviously he is out of position. Rake's not much of a factor because it's such a big game. So we've got the 7-6-3 flop, which is quite funny because I recorded a video for the BluffTheSpot lab yesterday, and I actually reviewed a hand where the board was 7-4-3 flush draw, and it was a really big pot. So we talked about check raising the flop. Anyway, so we get this board which is pretty good for Limitless. He's probably going to have 5-4 offsuit quite often, even 5-4 suited maybe. He's going to have some 2 pairs and 1 pairs and all kinds of draws and overcards with decent equity. So he gets to be pretty aggressive here. So this board is not very good for Linus, but it's not terrible, right? Again, he probably open raises 5-6 offsuit and obviously 3, 7, 6s, aces, kings, all the good stuff, ace 5 of spades. So Linus is doing fine here. But I definitely do not expect him to bet his full range. I expect him to have quite a few check behinds here. And Linus. So Linus decides to bet somewhat large, 331 in the 490. Okay. So he's saying, hey, I'm not just betting any 2 here. I've got a bit of a stronger range, so I'm going to size up, which seems like a good play. Once my computer allows him to raise. Calls. Okay. So calling is going to be Limitless's most common option, but he'll probably be check raising this board somewhere between 10 and 25% of the time. And this 7 changes so much, right? The flush got there, full house is filled up. Obviously, a 7 is a likely card for both players, so Linus is likely going to use some pretty big, but definitely under pot sizing. So let's see. I'm guessing it's somewhere between 600 and 900. And I'm wrong. All right. It's fun to see that I'm wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean that my suggestion doesn't work, but he basically chooses a small sizing and he's saying, hey, I know Limitless, I know you've got a lot of weaker draws and I'm putting them in a tough spot out of position. I'm forcing you to call with a lot of weaker value hands, like for instance a 6, etc. So Linus is really using his position here. He's a little bit afraid of the 7 and the flush, but at the same time he feels like protection and getting thin value are very important. So my guess is that Linus doesn't only implement this bet size, he probably also has some kind of larger sizing. And when you're as good as a guy like Linus, you get to use many sizes in different spots because you have an idea of what you're doing. That's a strategy that I wouldn't always recommend because it's very difficult to implement, right? Using multiple sizes in many different spots, but it definitely does work if you know what you're doing. So it's basically high risk, high reward. Limitless calls. So once he only calls his third pot bet, his range is going to be pretty weak. He's going to slow play some full houses and flushes, of course, but against his wide betting range, he's usually going to raise them. And this queen of spades definitely favors Linus. Linus is far more likely to have hands like queen 7 or pocket queens or the ace or king high or jack high flush. So Linus is going to be quite aggressive on this river. And let's see what he does. So, as I said, Linus gets to be aggressive, and he uses basically a full pot bet size, minus $3, always with the hip sizes. Yeah. So Limitless, he's going to call a pretty tight range here. He realizes that he doesn't have too many really good hands. He's going to float some hands like king of spades 10 on the flop and then on the turn, and he'll obviously call those. He'll have some random full houses and ace high flushes, but he's not doing super well. Or maybe he even check raises. Let's see. I have no idea what's going to happen. And he goes for the pretty small check raise, so he's saying he's got basically the ace high flush or better. And Linus shoves all in. I think that if Limitless had the king of spades against a pot size to bet, he wouldn't raise. So I'm not sure Linus would be shoving the ace of spades looking to get called by the king of spades. I think the ace of spades obviously is ahead far too often to be folding, but once you shove and get called, you're also getting called by full houses. So I think Linus mainly represents full houses at this point. Let's see. Limitless calls, and wow, that's pretty sick. That's a pretty sick cooler. So Limitless calls pre-flop with a6, which seems fine. He calls the flop. You can probably raise your hand occasionally, but calling is definitely the standard play. On the turn, same thing. You could basically check raise to get some value and protection, potentially turn your hand into a bluff on later streets, but calling is definitely the standard play. And on the river, you just have to check raise with the ace of spades. This is a very aggressive game, so when Linus pots the river, he can not only have the king high flush, but he could also maybe have the jack high flush, or maybe even the 10 high flush. So is it a snap raise by Limitless? It is a clear raise. It is not absolutely printing money, because Limitless shouldn't only have the best hand, but he also has to get called by a worse hand. It is definitely a check raise. And then once he gets shoved on, he's thinking, hey, my 6 is actually pretty convenient, because now I block 7-6, which Linus will play in this manner quite often, and I block hands like pocket sixes. So he's thinking, well, not only do I have the nut flush, so if I fold this hand, I'm probably folding quite a bit, because I also may have some bluffs, right? Obviously he will. Limitless is a fantastic player, but he will not only fold his bluffs, but if he folds an ace with a pair, then he's going to be overfolding, and he believes that Linus is obviously a very capable player who can turn hands into a bluff. So I'll give Limitless I'll give him a 7.5 out of 10. I'll give Linus I'll give him a 9 out of 10. I mean, I feel a bit weird commenting on players who are superior heads up, right? But it's my stream, and I get to give a rating, so I'll give Linus a 9 out of 10. I think, obviously, his open raise is good. I like the c-bet with the, nuts plus redraw. On the turn, you can do a million things, but he's basically thinking, well, I've got a weaker flush on a paired board, so if I ever want to be tricky, then, might as well bet this one, whereas maybe if you have a hand like king 5 of spades, or king deuce of spades, or whatever, then you go for the larger sizing, if he in fact has one. And on the river, Linus is saying, hey, I got a big flush, and obviously shoves the nuts over a check raise. So, yeah, really sweet play. I'll give him a 9+, actually. It's a really good play. So everything about it just seems good. Everything about it just seems good, as you'd expect. So, very fun first hand. What do you guys think of this one? Limitless doesn't mind saving the $5. He's too baller. And Linus goes after him with a 10.5 big blind 3-bet, which is a pretty normal sizing. I've seen some, 15 BB 3-bet sizes by Linus, some really funky stuff, but it seems that at 100 big blinds, he just chooses the standard sizing. Some people go 11.5, some people go maybe like 9.5. This is somewhere in the middle. Seems perfectly fine. And I don't think that changes your EV a whole lot. Obviously, if you 3-bet huge, you're going to 3-bet a little bit tighter, which means that ranges post-flop change a little bit, but other than that, making it half a big blind more or less is not going to change the game that much. So this is an interesting board where, some players might just bet to a full range on the flop, which is definitely not the best play in theory, but some people simplify their strategy like that. I assume that both of these guys are going to mix it up quite nicely on a board like this, which is what I would try and implement myself. So Linus bets a little bit under a third pot. So when he uses this sizing, he is saying he's betting a wide range, but I don't think he's betting his full range. I would be surprised if he were. So just because you mix it up doesn't mean that you have to go huge, right? You can use any sizing you like. Let's see what Limitless does. He probably is going to end up calling. Nope, he goes for the small raise. This is definitely the appropriate response some percentage of the time. So calling is going to be the most common option, but Limitless is thinking, well, I can't just have Linus, basically buy the turn for such a cheap price. I'm going to have to raise him sometimes and apply some pressure. So I definitely like this play, assuming obviously he's doing it with the right hand. And Linus calls. Again, that is going to be his most common option. There's going to be some all-in shoving here, or even some 3-betting on the flop, given that the board is somewhat draw-heavy. If the board are more like something like ace-4, well, then Limitless is not really going to raise very often, or at all. And then Linus, if he does get a raise, he doesn't really need to do much shoving, right? It's such a dry and lockdown board. Turn is a 3, which doesn't really change anything. 7-4 suited, I suppose, is possible for both players, but I think it's pretty unlikely. So if Limitless is happy with his hand on the flop, he should still be pretty happy on the turn. Now, it's definitely a good play to raise, let's say, like King Queen sometimes and then check behind the turn. But I expect Limitless to, bet here a decent amount of the time, and then probably bet for a, pretty small sizing. So let's see. I actually have a feeling he's going to check behind here. He does check behind, okay. And now this 4 is a bit more relevant, right? Because Linus definitely could have called the flop of 7-8. He definitely could have called 7s or 6-7 or a hand like Queen 7 even, or maybe something like King 7 of clubs. It definitely does improve him. A deuce is not really likely. So maybe Linus would have like ace deuce of clubs sometimes. Maybe he would 3-bet like a weaker suited hand like 4 deuce of clubs sometimes. But again, unlikely. So the 7 is quite decent for Linus. If he has an overpair like aces, it's still looking pretty decent. And this card doesn't improve Limitless that much. So again, he could have raised a hand like 6-7 of clubs, let's say, on the flop, or maybe some random a7 of clubs. So it's possible that he improves to, 2-pair or straight, but the runout is a bit more dry than it looks. So let's see if somebody represents a 7 here. If you represent a 7, all in is the decent sizing, but I expect Linus to potentially employ smaller sizing too, if he does bet, which he doesn't. And Limitless shove, so, this is kind of suspicious, right? Because what kind of 7 is Limitless now? What kind of 7 is he raising the flop with to then check back the turn with and then shove the river with? Now, of course, Limitless could just try and own Linus and just raise King Queen, check back turn, shove river, thinking Linus would have betted better hand himself, and if he puts him on a 7, he's going to call a lot of weird hands. So that's definitely possible, and with an aggressive dynamic, I think that Limitless has that type of play in him. Anyway, Linus is thinking I beat a lot of hands like 9-8 and stuff like Jack 10 or King 10 bluffs. I beat some flush draws potentially. So this is a bit of a suspicious spot. Okay. Interesting. So, Linus 3-bets pre-flop with King 6 suited, which is something that he won't always do, but sometimes is fine. He c-bets a flop thinking, well, I've got second pair, good kicker, I unblock a lot of air that's going to continue, or not air, but let's say hands like club draws, straight draws, etc. So, and once he gets raised, thinking, well, I don't block any of them, and I block King Queen, his hand's an easy call, check full range on the turn, because the 3 doesn't improve him, and on the 4, Linus is thinking, well, I don't think many worse hands are going to call. I still unblock all the air in Limitless's range. Let me just check. And then Limitless, and then he calls the river thinking, well, I kind of unblock a lot of air hands, and I don't really buy it. And if Limitless had king queen and he tried to own me, well, I do have a king, so that's less likely. So I'll give Linus a... I'll give him a 10. I'll give him a 10. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with this play. Obviously, it's a light play, and if you always call these types of hands, right, you're going to get owned eventually. So it's something you'll have to do selectively and carefully. But I like everything he did. Obviously, not always 3-bet pre-flop, but he probably used an RNG, or who knows what else he looked at. But I love the play. I thought it's fantastic. It's obviously a thin play, and he's not happy about it, but I love the play. It's an awesome one. There's nothing else to say. Now, Limitless play is a little bit more interesting. He opens ace-9 and calls a 3-bet. All three options with ace-9 make a bit of sense. I'm not going to show you any heads-up charts, but ace-9 is one of those hands intuitively, right? Calling, I mean, if you fold ace-9, you're definitely folding quite a bit, but then again, you could 4-bet. That would not be the worst play. Calling, the EV is pretty close with all three options. If you have like ace-deuce offsuit, well, the EV of folding is highest, right? Because I mean, you cannot just 4-bet ace-deuce up to ace-9. That would be far too aggressive. But ace-9 is pretty close. And then Limitless is probably thinking he won the flop. It's kind of close between a call and a fold, right? But this hand has, it blocks aces. It has the 9 that I can use for backdoor bluffing. So I'm going to turn it into a bluff. I think that it's not the worst play in the world, but it's quite aggressive. It's very aggressive. And then on the turn, he checks behind, thinking, well, now I just block hands like ace-king that bet fold and, bet call and they just fold anyway. And on the river, he's thinking, well, I block some of Linus's traps and I don't block any club draws. So I'm just going to shovel in and represent the 7, which is, again, very aggressive but understandable. I'll give Linus. So Linus is the Limitless and Linus's baby. So I'll give Linus I'll give him a 7 out of 10. I think the play is a little bit too aggressive. Now, I think this play against a much weaker player would be fantastic, right? So it would be a good way of just running over somebody. Somebody who's, let's say, scared money taking a shot, or somebody who's just a bit weaker. So if Limitless played this hand at, let's say, 500 heads up, this would probably be a very good play, in the sense that it's a bit aggressive, but taking advantage of people who are a bit too tight. But Linus is not somebody you can accuse of being too tight or scared money, right? Because, he loves the battle. So, yeah, very fun hand. We've got a 2.5x raise and a call by Linus. 9-7-3 flush draw is one of those boards on which you could use a million different strategies. Most players, including myself, tend to size up on a board like that and be a bit more polarized. I mean, Linus is going to hit this board quite often. He's going to defend a lot of 7x and 9x in the big blind. At 3, not so much, but he's also going to defend hands like Jack 8, Jack 10, 8 6, 8 5, 6 4, 6 5, all that type of stuff. Flush draws, over cards that are doing all right. So this is not a board in which you're going to get rid of him very easily. So sizing up and making Linus pay to continue is, in my opinion, the way to go. Let's see what Limitless does. So Limitless decides to bet on the bigger side, which I definitely like. Good stuff. And Linus check raises. So Linus is saying, hey, I've got a lot of medium strength hands, so I'm check raising. Not too large, not too small. Representing a pretty good hand, but not just a nuts or nothing. Because Linus would always 3-bet 9s, I assume. Often 3-bet 7s. Maybe 3-bet 3s sometimes. 9-7 offsuit I do think he has often. And Limitless ends up 3-betting, which is interesting. Some players elect not to 3-bet this flop, or a flop similar to this. If you were to look this up in a solver, it would definitely tell you to 3-bet sometimes. So Limitless is basically saying, like, hey, I've got a hand which is quite good right now. Let's say I'm like pocket jacks, but there's not a lot of runouts I'm excited about. So let me just fast play my hands. And I could get it in poorly, but I could also just get called. Like, I could get it in fine, slightly ahead. And I can also just get called by many worse hands. So definitely an okay play by him. And what is Linus going to do? So Linus calls, which is going to be, a pretty frequent option. You can shovel in, of course, even though Limitless does have 9k behind. But calling will be the most frequent option. And this 9 is a fantastic card for Linus. I mean, he's going to check raise and then call a 3-bet with a 9 quite often, so he's now ahead of Limitless's overpairs. He's filled up with some hands like, for instance, 9-7 or 9-3. 9-3 only suited, of course. He's not going to defend 9-3 offsuit. And if Limitless has, let's say, you know, big draw, like let's say Jack-10 of clubs, well, now he has significantly fewer outs. Plus, he only has 1 card to hit with. I wouldn't be shocked if Linus ended up going for some kind of small lead here. I have no idea what he's going to do, but that's definitely a part of a good strategy, having some kind of leading range. He elects not to lead this time. Obviously, you're not leading your full range here. And Limitless goes for a small bet, saying like, hey, I'm still happily value betting something that's not the nuts, and I'm putting you in a tough spot with a lot of your decent hands and with your draws. So sweet play by Limitless. And if he bets his sizing, there's going to be, you know, roughly pot behind, so he doesn't need to go huge to get the money in. Let's see. Wow, okay. So he doesn't call. He actually check min raises, basically, which is a very funky play. So he's basically saying he's got a 9 or better, and not even every 9, because sometimes he would just, you know, check all the flop or not check raise here. So he's putting Limitless in a tough spot, saying, hey, you're not just going to value bet your pocket jacks and check back the river, potentially. I'm going to make you pay. And I can also take hands like, let's say, 8-5 of clubs and play him in this fashion. And not just have to call with 8 high and then lose to your bluffs on the river that check behind. So very, very advanced, but good plays. Let's see. Limitless is usually going to end up calling here. Yep, he does. And this 6 definitely changes things. I mentioned 8-5 of clubs. That's now straight. 10-8 is now straight. The backdoor hearts get there. So very, very relevant card. Let's see what Linus does. He ends up checking. Okay. And Limitless, he shoves for around 60% pot with so little behind, you know, and being in position. If he had a hand like Jacks, he's likely just checking behind. So he's saying, well, he's got much better than that. In which case, you just want to end up putting in the maximum amount of money when the maximum is 60% pot. And it would be pretty boring if Linus folded. So he doesn't. Ah, wow, sick. All right, okay. All right, so interesting play. Open preflop by Limitless standards, obviously. I mean, your hand is not fantastic, but we're playing heads up. And he c-bets the flop with top 2 pair. You could check back occasionally, but on a board this draw heavy, betting, if you always bet this hand, I wouldn't call that a mistake. And he sized up. He gets check raised, and he's happy to see that, of course. So, you know, the issue with 9-7 is that you block two cards that are going to call you, because Linus might check raise a 9 or a 7 and then call a 3-bet. So your blockers to, you know, his continuing range are not fantastic. When you get called, it's, you know, pretty reasonable to assume that Linus is on a draw, even though he wasn't this time. So, you know, Limitless is going to sometimes call, sometimes 3-bet here. I don't mind it. And on the turn, checking behind is definitely, you know, an idea. I mean, you've got the stone nuts, and you unblock all of the draws that Linus could just improve with, right? So if Linus had 8-5 of clubs, why not let him see the river and just let him blast off, right? Or let him check call or do whatever to get more money in the pot. So checking behind would have been a cool play. Anyway, he does decide to bet. And obviously, you have to spread your good hands, right? You can't just always trap him. You can't always bet him. You have to mix it up. And then, obviously, Limitless calls the check raise with the nuts and shoves the river. So I'll give Limitless an 8 out of 10. I think it was a pretty sweet play. Linus's play is way more interesting. So he calls pre, which I like. He check raises the flop. And I expect Linus to maybe sometimes check call with bottom 2, right? On a board that's going to run out ugly pretty often. So, yeah, I don't mind the check raise, but calling is definitely good sometimes as well. And then he calls a 3-bet. Shoving all in wouldn't be the worst play, having 2 pair and blocking sets and unblocking bluffs and draws and whatever. But he decides to call, probably also because they were a tiny bit deeper. And he's probably trying to shove a lot of blank turns, right? So if had the turn been, let's say, like the 4 of spades, he probably would have shoved all in. Instead, he decides to check raise the turn, which is very interesting. He's trying to represent a 9. He's trying to apply pressure to Limitless's overpairs. And obviously his bluffs and his semi-bluffs. So very sweet play. And then on the river, he's actually thinking, well, hey, I block sevens, I block threes, I block 9-7. I don't block any hands like, for instance, Jack 10 of clubs or Ace 5 of clubs. Hey, let me check call. So very funky play. The river call is, you know, very loose, but it's, again, okay. I'll give Linus, I'll give him an 8.5 out of 10. This is very, very high level play. I'm giving away way too much information, and I'm still holding back quite a bit. I'm still telling you, not even telling you guys everything because I don't want to give that away, and it's already getting really advanced. These guys are at the top of the heat, right? These guys are at the top of their game. These are very advanced plays. So yeah, really sweet stuff.